My name is Lisa Baer. I'm director of the University of Georgia Press. I want to welcome you all to the kickoff event for this year's Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. I am lucky enough to be on the board of judges and can honestly say that this is one of my favorite events in the University of Georgia calendar. This afternoon we have some wonderful writers and friends of the late beloved Pat Conroy talking about him and his legacy, and I am here to introduce my friend Jonathan Haupt, who is your moderator today. And I actually had to Google an appropriate Pat Conroy quote, which I'll probably maul in some way, but it is, "No story is a straight line," from Beach Music. 20 years ago, I was the marketing director at Southern Illinois University Press. I'm a South by Midwesterner, which is, I think, how I got this job. I had to claim the South part. So I was marketing director at the University Press of my alma mater, and I needed an assistant, and I ran an ad, and I hired a young man who had just graduated with his master's degree from the English department at SIU, and that young man was Jonathan Haupt. And he and I worked together for, I think, 2 years and became good friends. And then the No Straight Line stories come in. Then I moved off to Minneapolis, and he moved off to South Carolina after several years. And then 20 years later, I published his book, Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy. And for a few years there, I was director of the University of Georgia Press, and Jonathan was director of the University of South Carolina Press. So we thought that was a really nice synchronicity as well. And I cannot tell you how just heartening it is to have published Jonathan and to have published this amazing book, which is the first book that the press has co-published with the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame. And that also is, I think, really remarkable and wonderful. And just publishers inside gossip, we printed 5,000 copies of this book, which was a little less than the director wanted to print, but I trusted my team. I said, okay, well, that's what we're going to do. And we sold out before the official pub date. We had no books left in our warehouse. So the second printing arrives this week, and suffice to say, Pat Conroy is, I think, everyone's Prince of Scribes. So it's been a real pleasure. Jonathan Haupt is the executive director of the Pat Conroy Literary Center, the founding director of the Pat Conroy Literary Festival, and the former director of the University of South Carolina Press, where he created the Story River Books fiction imprint in partnership with Pat Conroy. Haupt serves on the boards of the South Carolina Academy of Authors and the Friends of South Carolina Libraries, and on the South Carolina Humanities Advisory Committee and the American Writers Museum Affiliates Steering Committee. With Charleston novelist Nicole Seitz, he is co-editor of the anthology Our Prince of Scribes, Writers Remember Pat Conroy. Jonathan.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you. Well, I don't think I'd be much of an editor if I didn't take a moment to correct Lisa's story. Or augment, perhaps. Augment Lisa's story. As she mentioned early on, she did place an ad that I responded to. The part she leaves out is that she placed that ad in direct defiance of human resources policy at Southern Illinois University. One of many lessons I learned from Lisa early on, who was a fantastic mentor to me. So to take a book about Pat Conroy, who was also a great mentor to me, and to be able to publish it with another mentor has been a remarkable experience. The first time I was in this room, this very lovely, extraordinary room, was when Lisa was being interviewed to be director of the University of Georgia Press. And I sat somewhere back there, and during the brief Q&A section, I asked her an absolute softball question, which she answered beautifully, and that's why she was hired, really. It was my doing. So you're welcome. You're welcome, University of Georgia. I was happy to do it. I'm here to add a little bit of credibility to this gathering of unknown regional writers on this panel. And we're going to talk about our friend, Pat Conroy. This book, Our Prince of Scribes, has been an absolute joy to work on. This is something that my infinitely more talented co-editor, Nicole Seitz, and I thought of while Pat was still around, while Pat was, just shortly after Pat had publicly announced that he was dealing with pancreatic cancer. And we sort of knew that legacy was going to become very important. And optimistically, we thought we could do this very quickly, and that one of the audience members for it would in fact be Pat, that there would be opportunity for Pat to read it. That was not at all the case. And yet, even as we continued to gather these stories, we still kept thinking of Pat. We still kept thinking this is the one guy who would most benefit from reading this book. After he got over the embarrassment of it being all about him, I think he would absolutely love the portraits of him that emerge in this book. In all, there are 67 contributors, so this is a relatively small group of the total pool of contributors you see on the stage before you. But over the course of sharing 67 different stories of Pat, 67 different perspectives, his whole life sort of emerges, not as he saw it, not as he described it, but as the rest of us saw it and experienced it with him in our respective roles. And because some of us knew him later in life than others, some of us knew him very briefly, you get really interesting glimpses into this man's life and to how many writers he affected. Some he influenced, some he mentored in a very specific way. Others he sort of came along with at the same time, peer to peer. And all of those stories collectively really give us, I think, a remarkable portrait of Pat. So I want to introduce these folks and then ask them to share some of their stories with all of you as well. So next to me here is Cynthia Graubart, former producer for the Food Network. She is co-author with Natalie Dupree of Mastering the Art of Southern Cooking, which won a James Beard Award for American cooking, the highest award a cookbook can receive. She's also the author of a number of other cookbooks, including Slow Cooking for Two, Sunday Suppers, and Chicken in the Savor of the South series, also a remarkable book as well. Cynthia, this is our last opportunity to make him leave and bring somebody else up. You sure you want me to introduce Cliff? Because Bill Walsh is like right there.
Let's do it.
Are you sure? We're committed. Okay.
We're going to do this.
Okay. Remember, it was your call in the end. Next in line, Cynthia's very distinguished husband. For those of you who are a handful of young people in the room, let me explain, sort of to give context. There used to be these things in Atlanta called bookstores. And Cliff owned the most iconic bookstore in Atlanta's literary life, the Old New York Bookshop, which appears prominently in Pat Conroy's book, My Reading Life. Fantastic chapter about that bookstore and about Cliff. Cliff is a native New Yorker. He's the author of The Curious Vision of Sammy Levitt and Other Stories, for which he was named Georgia Author of the Year for short stories. His short stories have also been published in the Atlanta Journal, Atlanta Magazine, a number of other places as well. Really fantastic writer and an iconic member of Georgia and Atlanta's literary life. On the end, in the anchor spot, Terry Kay. Terry is the author of 17 books, but his bio is so long he will have written the 18th by the time I am done introducing him. 3 of his novels have been adapted for Hallmark Hall of Fame movies, To Dance with a White Dog, The Runaway, and The Valley of Light. And I want to congratulate the organizers for picking like the only Sunday out of the year when one of those films is not currently airing on our channel, so we can all be here in honor of Terry. He is a 2006 inductee into the Georgia Writers Hall of Fame, 2009 recipient of the Governor's Award in the Humanities. Terry was honored in 2015 by the Atlanta Writers Club with the designation of its annual fiction award as the Terry K. Prize for Fiction. In 2011, he was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Georgia Writers Association, and he's received the Georgia Author of the Year Award 4 times. Now, Cliff has received it 1 time, but in Cliff's defense, he's only written that 1 book. So Cliff has had a 100% success rate, whereas Terry has written 17 and only gotten the award 4 times. So I think on balance, that one goes
Did
to
you pay him to
Cliff.
say that?
I did.
Terry has also won the Townsend Award. In 2007, he received the Brooke Baker Award from the Dunwoody Library and the Stanley W. Lindbergh Award for an individual significant contribution to the preservation and celebration of Georgia's literary heritage. So with that said, how about another round of applause for these three folks? All right, gang, that was the easiest applause you get. From here on out, you have to earn it. All right, so Cynthia is closest, and I'm going to start with you then, because Pat comes into your life because of that guy, which means you get to talk about Cliff a little bit. But tell us a little bit about how and when you first came to meet Pat Conroy.
You know, most people think it was Cliff that actually introduced me to Pat, but it was Natalie Dupree when I was producing her series. She said that this guy and his wife had just come back from Rome, and she was having a dinner party, and if I wanted to come by, I was welcome. And so there he was. I didn't know who he was at that time, but he certainly sucked all the oxygen out of the room, and a larger-than-life presence, and, you know, so magnetic. And it would be just a short time later that Natalie would introduce the two of us, and then subsequently Cliff introduced me to Pat, and he's, you know, Pat was always such a generous man. He always wanted to help people. His spirit was one of just, you know, he didn't want to talk about himself. He wanted to talk about you, and he wanted to know what was going on with you, and he always found a way to relate what was going on in his life, in your life. So you felt this incredible connection. And Pat and I connected when, somebody please remind me of the author, the book Military Brats. Does anybody remember that book?
It's, I don't know her name.
I regret that I don't recall her name. But Pat and I, we had in common military fathers, and I went to 10 schools in 12 years growing up, and we just knew what that meant, and the instability of that, and the instability of, you know, crazy fathers, and
Certainly.
That was a great way that I connected with him.
Sort of immediately.
Yeah,
Right.
and also the never being good enough. I was raised with that fear, and from my stepfather, that, you know, I just wasn't. Well, I wasn't a boy, so I sure wasn't going to measure up. But Pat also had that same thing, and he never felt deserving of an award, or, you know, he never, boy, don't count your chickens. But he really lived by that. He just didn't ever want to accept the accolade that he was so deserving of, and that comes from his background. And it was something that we shared.
That you shared with him. You know, Pat had a sort of internal great Santini that would beat him up when he did well and beat him up when he did poorly.
Yes.
You know. Cliff, have you been here this whole time?
Yes, I have.
Okay,
Thank you.
Good. Tell us about when Pat walked into the store for the first time.
Well, my upbringing is a little different than Cynthia's and Pat's. Next to Cynthia and Pat, my childhood was like a Walt Disney movie. And Pat adored my parents because of that. Pat walked into my store about a year and a half after I arrived in Atlanta from New York. So I had an edge. When Pat describes me in my reading life, he describes me like Don Rickles without the jokes, you know, just, and it's all Pat being exaggerating.
Good audience, they know who Don Rickles is.
They know who Don Rickles is, thank God. Good. I realized soon I won't be able to use that line. He walked into my store on Piedmont Avenue, and he was very friendly. He had been writing a novel called The Great Santini in a house on 15th Street across from the Art Museum in Atlanta. And to come home, he would drive down Piedmont Road, and there was a long traffic line around rush hour from Monroe Drive up to the park. And as he inched towards that traffic light, he saw these books sticking out from a little store. I had a storefront, and it said books 25 cents. Pat owned one hardbound book in his library, The Lives of the Saints, given to him probably by a priest or a nun. That was it. Everything else was a paperback. He walked into my store. He was very friendly. Introduced himself as Pat Conroy. Never heard of the guy. He hadn't written but one book, well, two books. He self-published his first book, The Boo, and then he had written The Waters Wide in 72. This was April of 73. And we just talked. We connected over baseball. He told me he was a writer. And I said, whoa, that's pretty exciting. And he had just come back from Savannah, where he interviewed Clint Courtney, manager of the Savannah Braves. Well, I went nuts because I was a baseball kid, and Clint Courtney used to be a catcher for the Baltimore Orioles. And I said, Clint blank Courtney? This is incredible. So he came back the next day because couldn't believe what he was looking at. I had about 10,000 books in this 1,200 square foot maze. It became a maze because I ran out of wall space and then had to come in. It was really like a maze. And after 2 weeks, he invited me to his house for a soiree. I went to my girlfriend at the time. Cynthia wasn't born yet. Close. Almost. Almost. And there was these writers. Terry Kay was there with his wife, Tommy. It took me about a year to figure out who was Terry and who was Tommy. I never could figure it out. And
Us Bill don't know.
And Jim Townsend was there, and they named, as Jonathan mentioned, Jim Townsend Award that Terry won. Jim Townsend was an editor of Georgia Magazine and Atlanta Magazine, and Pat had been in Savannah writing about the Braves for Georgia Magazine. So I'd met these writers. I never met writers in my life. My store was selling used books, not new books. I had no idea what author signings were about or any of that. It wasn't part of my life. Pat was about to change my life. And he did. He came in every day. If he wrote 5 pages a day, that was a big day for Pat. He hand wrote on a 8 by 11 yellow.
Legal pads.
No, what do you call it?
Legal pads.
Legal pads. And it's exhausting. And he'd take a break, and he'd come to the store. Sometimes he'd come in the afternoon, because he just devoured the store. It opened his world. He discovered America when he came into that store. And I got into writing because of Pat. Everybody was writing. It was Pat's idea to have an autograph party at the store because he wanted to help me make a living because I was struggling. He said, well, let's have an autograph party. What's an autograph party? How do you do it? Well, we'll have champagne. We'll have a reception. Okay. Whatever he said, I said, okay. So we met Vern Smith. He was a a string. He worked for Newsweek. He was an African-American author from Mississippi who graduated from a college in San Francisco, now working for Newsweek magazine. He had written a novel called The Jones Men. And so we met Vern for drinks at the mansion on Piedmont in downtown Atlanta in 1895, circa 1880s. And we had drinks with Vern. I said, Vern, what do you think? Great. I haven't had one. So we said, let's do it. We had no idea what we were doing. So mailed out invitations. I said, Pat, how are we going to do this? He says, well, I'm going to give you a list of names. Vern's going to give you a list of names, and you have a list of store names. It'll be invitation only. I didn't know they had autograph lines at stores and stuff like that. So I went down to Tower Liquors and bought 15 bottles of Andre champagne for $2.97. Terry drank a lot of that champagne. Pat said the champagne was so cheap the grapes rose to the glass, top of the glass. Came back to the store. This was at 6 when I closed the store. Got the champagne, put it in a big tub, 3 bags of ice over it, screwed in these plastic champagne glasses I got. And they're sitting all out there, and we just waited. And 7:30 came, and the invitation said, Pat Conroy and the Old New York Bookshop cordially invite you for an autograph party and champagne reception for Vern Smith, and who wrote, author of The Jones Men. Thursday, 7:30. 7:30 came, people started coming in. And my store was in a house. It was in a 2-story house. I lived under it. You walked in on the top floors, 12 rooms of books, a living room. And the living room was where I had the coffee machine. It was a Bonomatic from a diner, 3 coffee pots. So every customer had their own cup. Terry's cup just said K on it, K-A-Y. Pat said Conroy. The great Santini said Santini. And everybody would come in, grab a cup, and get a coffee, and just throw the bull, talk and whatever. We sent out about 100 invitations, and about 90 people made it. It was fabulous. As soon as they came in, everybody just started recognizing. This group recognized people in their group, and this group, and before you know it, people just drinking cheap champagne and having a ball. And the books were on the desk, and they got them, and Vern would be sitting or standing, and everybody's centering on it. It was a blast. It was terrific, and that's how my store grew.
Well, Terry, tell us about how that group of writers existed in the first place, and how Conroy became a part
I first really wanted to straighten one. That champagne was made of grapes? Why did it have a potato on the side? It was ungodly. It was ungodly. He didn't tell you about the hors d'oeuvres. Cheese whiz on a cracker.
There were no hors d'oeuvres.
It's the one thing that Cliff is not saying about the store is that until that period of time, there had been sort of an absence of any attention of writers in the state of Georgia. At one time, there'd been a great many, but at this particular period, there weren't many people being published out of Georgia. And when my first book was published in '76, there were fewer than 10 people in the state being published. There were a lot of people beginning to write, but the whole thing of self-publishing was not very evident at that time, and not many people were doing it. The thing that the Old New York Bookstore did was sort of galvanized people. It was a place where we could go and The autograph parties, as Cliff has described them, were very special. There's no question about it. It was almost a kind of thing where out of that group grew sort of Atlanta's answer to the Algonquin Club. And I've encountered that over the years a few times where they thought, well, you had this select group of writers. Well, yeah, because there are only a few of us. So it was very select, you know, that. Annie Siddons and Pat and Paul Darcy Bowles and me and Paul Hemphill and, you know, some of those guys. It gave us a place, but there was an unspoken thing about it that to be embraced by this group, you had to have a signing at the O'Neill bookstore. I mean, that was it. That was that was the approval. Although Riches was there and a woman named Faith Brunson, and she was powerful, absolutely powerful. And Faith had this thing that she did not mind writers having a signing at Cliff's store, but they damn well better not do it before they signed at Riches. And Cliff was very upfront about it. We'll schedule one here, but go sign at Riches first, because there's no reason to get into trouble. Faith would just simply pull your book out.
She would pull the book.
She'd pull it, and she would tell you up front, you will not, your book won't be in my store, you know. But that doesn't, I don't want to suggest that she was bad for the business, because she wasn't. She was really probably the most powerful person in the Southeast at one time in book selling, you know. So it was a special thing for all of us. My meeting of Pat was really business more than anything else. They were shooting The Water is Wide in St. Simon's, and I was still, at the time I met him, I was still working for the Atlanta Journal, although I left shortly after I met him. But Jim Townsend's magazine sent me to St. Simon's to do a story on the filming, because my experience at the Journal was film and theater after I had spent a little career in sports writing. So I went there. I met him right before I left to go down there. And he said, I'll see you in St. Simon's. I said, sure. So we got together in St. Simon's, spent a lot of time just talking, you know, getting to know one another. And when that was over, came back to Atlanta, and I started seeing him a great deal after that.
Just to sort of quickly put this into context so you can understand how much this circle of writers meant to Pat at this point in his life. After he had written The Water is Wide and had been published, he was essentially unwelcome in the state of South Carolina. It's hard to sort of conceptualize that now as we think about the book, but at the time, it was incredibly controversial. Pat's career as a professional educator was effectively over, and the movie was about to come out. So he and his family had moved back to Atlanta, the city of his birth, and to then be welcomed into this circle of friends, this circle of writers, and Cliff and the store. All of that was incredibly important to Pat, to cementing for him he was on the right path as a writer, that there would be this community that would support him. So that was absolutely key. The book, Our Prince of Scribes, is not just a matter of 67 stories. There's sort of tapestry that emerges. They interact. And Cliff and Cynthia probably show up almost as much as Pat in these essays. But the story that gets referenced so often, which I would love for one or both of you to share, is the story of your wedding, which Pat is supposed to have a role in, but doesn't quite work out that way.
Oh, he has a role.
He has a role.
He has a big role.
So when Cliff so delicately, have y'all seen how people get engaged now? They're like these big productions and all. Cliff said, I think we ought to get married. You know, not even down on one knee, right? I said, okay, we'll get married. And we were, I said, why don't you start making a list of who you would invite, kind of get an idea of what we were looking at. He gets to 200 people in about 10 minutes. And I said, I'm not up for that. And so we'd been talking about, how would we do this? And it was actually Pat's wife at the time, Lenore, who said, we should think about coming to Rome. They were going to be back in Rome that summer. Pat said, that would be great. I'll take care of everything. Y'all just come. It'll be wonderful. Gosh, it sounded like a great idea. So I did all the groundwork in the States. There are all kinds of documents to fill out, and even Natalie had a luncheon for us for the consulate to come and sign the formal papers, and she made a lovely big to-do about it. And she also came over to Rome to stand up for me. And so, I'm a blushing bride, packing carefully we were going to be gone a month. And just a terribly exciting time. And we leave, and...
Let me say one thing.
Okay.
Just before this happens, I tell Cynthia, great news. Terry just came into the store and said, we're going to Europe. Because I had been making fun of Terry for 15 years, telling me, Terry, you're never going to be just but a hokum rider until you get your tail out of Georgia and get to Europe. One day, Terry comes in and says, we're going to Europe. I was 46. Cynthia was 27. I had never been married, and Cynthia knew in her heart that I was going to Europe because I wasn't coming back. That's what she thought. So Terry and I went to Europe. We had a ball.
This was only
a month before,
a few weeks before
we got engaged, before our
I was
engagement party.
I was a little nervous.
I came back.
He did.
30 years later, we're still doing okay.
Yeah. So we fly off. In fact, Anne and Hayward Siddons flew over for the wedding. So we're all gathered in Rome and waiting to hear from Pat all of the details. He said the wedding was going to be July 8th. We came in about 5 days early, 4 or 5 days early. Natalie arrived ahead because she was preparing a amazing wedding supper for us on the rooftop terrace of Pat and Lenore's apartment. So I'm all excited for the details. Well, Pat has to admit to us that he had done nothing. Now, I didn't know Pat that well to know that you didn't trust him. I forgot that he wrote fiction. I don't know whatever possessed him to say that he would take care of the details, or why my husband, for that matter, believed him. But there we are, sitting there thinking, now, we were going to go on to visit his parents, and it was pretty important to me that he and I be married before we go and stay with his parents. And so I said, okay, worst case scenario, because Cliff's getting a little nervous at this point, worst case scenario, at the supper we have already planned, we'll just have Pat officiate, we'll consider ourselves officially married, and then when we get back to the States, we'll go to the Justice of the Peace. So that's our backup plan. Well, Pat makes a call to Anne Guerrieri, and good friend, mover and shaker in Rome.
Yeah.
And that woman, along with a lot of lira from my husband's pocket, and many, many stops around the city over the next 3 days, got us a date, and we were married in the Campidoglio, an official ceremony in a building designed by Michelangelo, sitting in red velvet, crushed velvet covered gold throne-like chairs. I couldn't decide if it was really Renaissance looking or bordello looking. It was really on that line.
It was real, though. It wasn't an imitation.
Yeah, it was really on the line. So Pat was so well-intentioned. I know he really wanted that to happen. It was in his heart that he knew that we were going to get married in Italy. He just didn't have a clue what to do. So he did typical Pat. He did nothing. But as you all see, we are sitting next to each other 30 years later, and it all worked out.
I would like to renew my vows. What also occurred, kiss me, Terry. What also occurred was about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, a movie came out called Quiz Show. It was a movie. It was produced by Julian Cranen. Well, Julian Cranen won an Academy Award for documentary filmmaking. He had come to Rome to meet Pat, to see Pat. He had already spoken with him before because he wanted Pat to write the screenplay for The Homeward Angel. And Julian wanted to film it and be the producer of that movie. He happened to be there at the time because he had to do a documentary in Florence. So Pat said, well, Julian, my friend's coming over to get married. Why don't you film it? So Julian Cranen started filming a day or two before we arrived because there's filming of Natalie preparing the dinner. Then he walked with us around Rome for a couple of days. As we went to the embassy, we went to this, we went to that, just filming us. And I forgot he was there most of the time. He was eating with us, but filming with us. You just didn't notice it. And then he filmed the wedding, and that was it. And 3 or 4 months later, a video cassette comes in the mail with an apology. Sorry, I didn't edit it. We have a 2-hour film of our whole experience in Rome.
It's like an award-winning documentary filmmaker.
I mean, if you watch it, you would be so bored because it's unedited. It's just, we're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing this, we're doing that. It starts off with Pat talking to him about The Homeward Angel and him reading, I think, some lines from his screenplay.
Yes, yeah.
That ends with us walking down the steps of the Campidoglio and people beeping the horn at us in Rome. Italy. The Atlanta paper said we were going off to Rome, Georgia, to get married.
Yeah, the night editor inserted the Georgia part. Didn't quite believe that was going to happen in Italy.
Well, Cliff did bring a copy of the film with him, so we're gonna watch it when we're done.
Start. And now this means.
Well, the pieces in this book, many of them were original to this book. Some had been previously published as Pat passed away, and people who knew him were asked to write for publications. And Terry was one of those. Terry's essay originally appeared in Atlanta Magazine. And when Nicole and I read that, we thought, we've got to get permission for that, because it was such a fascinating glimpse into Pat's life in Atlanta and his relationship with the writers here. And also Terry wrote beautifully about sort of Pat being on the cusp, not just on the cusp of being famous, but on the cusp of realizing that fame was in his future. But Terry, would you tell us a little bit about what that transition was like when Pat sort of realized things were starting to happen for him?
Well, Pat made the claim. I didn't make that up at all. And I went to the boys, Cliff being one of them, and said, did you hear this? Do you remember this? And all of them agreed that yes, in one way or the other. He did say one night, in something of a melancholy mood, because we had been drinking some very good wine, much better than the champagne stuff that Cliff used to offer. And in a melancholy mood, he said, boys, they're about to make me famous, and I don't know what to do with it. My immediate thought was, of all the people I've ever known in my life, and in the years that I worked at the newspaper, especially doing film and theater and that sort of stuff, I met a whole lot of people out of that industry, actors and directors and writers, and I never met anyone more gifted with charisma than Pat. Of course he was going to be famous. If they had not said that to him, he would have been famous. It was in his nature. It was just there for him. I think his greatest talent was charisma. He was a fine, fine writer. Don't get me wrong about that. He was, especially in his short work. His short work was just brilliantly done, essays and letters, etc. But more than anything else, he had this overwhelming charisma that he could walk. He was big. He could walk into a room and take it over. You know, we've heard that cliche, and he certainly could do that. But I was struck by that, and I remembered it so clearly. I could almost take you to the place and put you where everybody was sitting, and when he said it, it was bound to happen, and it has happened. It affected Pat a great deal over time, I think. I've always said I knew him for 40 years. We were really close the first 20. We were not close the second 20 because he had adapted another group had adopted another group of people that were his friends. But that's necessary when you become famous, as he was. You know, you gather people, and all of those, so many of us from that first 20 years, we all agree the same thing, that it was very difficult to know him in the last 20 years. I didn't know him very well at all. And we were cousins, for crying out loud. I mean, actually related. I've been told by many people, asked by many people, well, Pat was the reason you're a writer. Well, that's just totally nonsense. I was writing 10 years before he ever picked up a bic, you know. No, I was doing that. Pat was very instrumental in one thing in my career. He made one phone call. Mm-hmm. And that phone call was to his editor at Houghton Mifflin, a woman named Ann Barrett, who was one of the most renowned editors in the country at that time. She had been Tolkien's American editor, for example. Because Pat had, when I got to know him, he began to pester me about writing fiction, and I had no desire to do it at all, just no interest in it, no desire. But he believed I should do that. And at the same time, Townsend was hounding me to write for him, be a contributing editor for his magazine. And every time I took down a story, which was always a movie essay, he would say, "Where's my story?" And I'd say, "What are you talking about, Jim?" He said, "The story. I want you to write a story. You're a writer and you don't know it, and I'm going to tell you that you are." And one day, to get him off my back, I said to him, "Jim, can I write what I want to write, half truth, half fiction?" He said, "I don't care what it is, just go write something." So that afternoon, I sat down and I wrote a story called "I Was a Teenage Quarterback," or the Hoodoo Voodoo on Hut Hut. It was about playing football for a Class C school in Northeast Georgia. And I took it in there, and I was waiting for the call from Townsend to tell me that it wasn't up to standard and I needed to redo it. I was working on Barcliff Road at the time, and one day Pat came into the office, and we sat down, chatted for a minute, and I finally said, "Pat, you've got to be here for some reason. What is it? Otherwise, you need to leave because I got work to do." He said, "I went down to the magazine this morning and turned in a piece, and I couldn't find anybody. And I was walking around, and I heard all this laughter coming out of this one room." And said, "I went back there, and in this one room, every member of the staff was in there, and they were sitting around, passing around pages from your story." And I said, "What's funny?" And they handed me the first sheet and said, "Read this." And he read it, and he said, "This is as good as anything William Price Fox has ever written." Now, I knew Price Fox, and I knew how good he was, and I was really taken by that. That's when he started pushing me to write fiction. And I said, "I don't want to do it. One afternoon at the Prince pub in Atlanta, Jim, who was an admitted alcoholic, and Pat, who's an Irishman,
Draw your alcohol.
they were talking, and why I wouldn't write fiction, and Pat said, I know how to make him do it. And he went to the phone and he called Ann Barrett and said that he had just read 150 pages that his friend Terry Kay was working on, and he thought it was wonderful, and they ought to see it. And I had no idea that he had done this. I got a letter from Ann asking me to send this 150 pages he was raving about. I called him and I said, Pat, he said, yeah, I know, I got a copy of the letter. Then I later found out he actually got a finder's fee for finding me. And
That's hilarious.
yeah, well, it's true. And anyway, I went over to his house and yelled at him and cursed him and told him, I really would appreciate it if you'd get out of my life. I didn't want to do this. Please leave me alone. Finally, he said, you can do one of two things. You can tell her I was drunk and I lied, or you can write 150 pages. And he knew what I would do. He knew I'd write 150 pages. I did it in a month without correcting spelling, without correcting grammar, anything. To get him off my back, I just sent it in to them. And to my great surprise, they offered me a small advance in a contract to write a novel. And that's how I got started. That's what Pat did for me. A lot of people think Pat taught me how to write. He didn't teach me a thing about writing. I had been doing it a long time. But boy, that helped me a great, great deal, you know. And I'm sure he did a lot, same thing for other people. I've done the same thing. Every writer I know has done the same thing. But he had an interest in it. His real influence in the state of Georgia was he got New York publishers to look at Atlanta writers.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That was it. Mm-hmm. And that goes back to the personality and the charisma he had.
Right, sure.
They still don't get it, but he gave a big effort.
Yeah. Well, to pick up on something Terry said about knowing Pat really well during the first 20 years of their 40-year span together, I knew Pat very well during the last 5 years of his life. I knew him off and on for the last 12 years of his life, but during the very productive last 5 years, he and I were partners in a fiction imprint that we created at the University of South Carolina Press called Story River Books. And in just 5 years' time, Pat and I selected, championed, and published 22 books, novels, short story collections, and many of those writers share their stories in our Prince of Scribes, too, about what it was like to be mentored, to be taught in the big sense of that word by Pat Conroy during those 5 years. Not just taught about the writing process, but to go on tour with him. Pat was always a draw for an audience. If Pat were here, the room would be full, and we'd be shocked because he's dead, but it would be full. But and this was true, of course. So we would have these evenings with Story River Books, and hundreds of people would show up, and Pat would say next to nothing about himself, but everything about the writers he was there with. He would turn his readers into their readers, and experiences great vicarious joy in seeing them succeed, because the internal Santini couldn't get in the way of celebrating somebody else. It could only get in the way of celebrating Pat.
Yep.
So those stories are in here too, but and I was a part of them, so I read them and I know and I remember the experience. But I was not a part of the stories that y'all had. So this book is also a way for me to get to know my friend Pat Conroy in a way that I didn't. And I think that's true for all of you as you read this too. You get insights into other people who knew him at different times and in different ways. So what I'd love for you to do, since obviously all 67 writers are not here, if you could maybe reference a couple of essays or a couple of time periods, things that you learned about Pat from having a look through the book.
Well, I was shocked at how many times my husband's name appeared in this book.
A lot, yeah.
That was pretty funny. I'm not surprised. I'm actually delighted. I have to say that, Cliff and I were on our way to meet Jonathan at the Southern Festival of Books. And the pile next to each side of our bed the piles are this tall of books by friends that we need to read. And this has was sitting there, but we hadn't gotten to it yet. And so I read aloud almost the whole way to Nashville.
Yeah.
And we cried probably 3 times. We choked up over people's stories. They are so touching that someone who may have only come up close to Pat one time for a few minutes, or received a letter, or received a phone call, a note of encouragement, an introduction that changed their life. This book is a collection, just a drop in the bucket of the lives that Pat Conroy changed. He changed my husband's life. He changed the course at that point of what Terry was doing. But every one of these stories, I mean, they're all so wonderful, and they all say essentially the same thing. Mm-hmm. The man changed my life. So I can't pick one. They're all fabulous.
Cynthia has dodged the question, but she did so beautifully. Beautifully.
Well, I know almost all those people. They're going to hear about who I talked about.
Cliff, anything you want to add to that?
One of the stories we read was Terry's piece.
Yes.
And Terry talked about, in his piece, he talks about the boys. Mm-hmm. I think that's the only one I've read that even mentions that. And the boys were essentially 5 of us. We got together. And it was usually Pat's idea. Let's get together. And Terry would cook, or Pat would cook. They were the best cooks. You and Pat did most of the cooking. And Terry wrote about Pat about to be famous. And I remember that evening in North Carolina. Terry left out this part where Pat was a little bit angry. He was drinking. We're all drinking. And
I was drinking milk.
you were drinking, but you shocked me. You left it out in the story. You didn't mention it.
And I wish you'd leave it out right now, to be honest.
I won't. Anyway, Terry didn't like the way it was going because Pat was angry going after me, Bernie, and Dan about our childhoods.
And Frank.
And Frank? Yeah, and Frank.
Frank.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, and that it wasn't all so rosy. It was pretty rosy for me.
Pretty rosy for you.
Pretty rosy for Dan. Bernie, it's pretty rosy. Frank, the only problem Frank had was his father was a principal of a school, so he always had, stuff he had to deal with. And all of a sudden, he's going after us, and I don't know what's going on in Terry's mind, but Terry stands up and he says, "Graubart, what? He said, I'm drunk. I got to go to the bathroom." Only he didn't say bathroom. So
I don't remember any of this. Well, you were drunk, I think, not me.
And so I get up, and I'm shocked. I've never seen Terry drunk. He never got drunk. And so I get up, and, "Come on, Graubart." And so everything stops. And I get a hold of Terry's waist, and we're walking up. It's a little bit of an incline. I said, "Terry, are you okay?" He said, "I'm fine. I'm not drunk. But I got to put a stop to this. We got to put a stop to this." Do you remember?
Well, let me correct a little bit of this. You're right, 90% of it. Pat could be, believe me, he's a sweet man. He could be mean.
He could be
He'd
tough.
be really mean. And on this particular night, he was really mean.
He was going after
And he was going mainly after Frank over something Frank had written that he didn't like.
Forgot about that.
And when he decided to drop the hammer on what you had written, if he didn't like it, he was brutal. He was absolutely brutal. unnecessarily brutal, by the way. And in this particular night, I didn't like what he was doing to Frank. Well, one of the things Pat could not stand was to be mimicked. He just couldn't stand it. So every time he would say something, I said it right after him. I mocked him. Every time he would say, remember? He would say something, and I'd repeat it. And it just got angrier and angrier and angrier, but he deserved it. That night, he deserved it because he was being mean.
It's amazing about selective memory. I remember it like yesterday. I remember him pulling this stunt, and I do remember now that he went after Frank. I forgot what it was. You'll tell me later. But you just selectively remember things. It's just remarkable.
But don't get me wrong. Everybody has that in them. We all do. To some degree, we have that. With somebody as intense as Pat, it could become pronounced. It really was. I crossed swords with him several times over what he was writing and what I was writing. Nothing malicious about any of it. But if he said, "What do you think about it?" I remember when he bought the Prince of Tides. He wanted me to read the manuscript, and I did. Well, the Prince of Tides was about 500 pages too long, as we all know. He knew it, in fact. And I said to him, "Pat, why don't you take this book and cut it right in half? You've got two books here, separate books."
You said thirds.
No. He said the editor said there were 4 books there. And I said, well, she's probably right, but I know there's 2, the Low Country story and the New York story. But he would not listen at all when it came to that. He just wouldn't do it because he was very sure that the greatest laugh, Jonathan, I've ever had about my friend Pat Conroy was when I read this business card. It had the word editor on it.
Boy, I do remember you finding it amusing that Pat was going to be editor-in-chief of our fiction.
Yeah, I know.
Yes.
Actually, I thought he was a good editor. Before the Prince of Tides, I could show him anything I wrote.
Yeah.
And I wrote a story, the story that appears in my book about boxing. I gave him the stories, and because he wasn't famous. But after he became famous, he was terrified about reading his friends' works because he was afraid he wouldn't like it. So he was terrified. So I never showed him anything after the Prince of Tides.
I never thought about that same thing. I never showed him anything. Never did.
But when I showed him this story about boxing, he liked it. I showed him the first thing I ever wrote. And I remember he came in the store, and I said, and I was writing only because everybody's writing. I'm having all these autograph parties. Everybody becomes a damn writer. And I said, all right, I'm going to write. So I wrote a story. And the first story I gave him, I said, read this. I wrote this. And so he went, took it, got a cup of coffee, got his cup off the wall. He came back, and my desk was here, and he went like this, and he said, and I knew immediately he liked it. Because he would, really looking back, he would have been cautious and helpful and encouraging and try to put me down slowly, softly. Yes. And he did that to everything I ever showed him, which was about 4 or 5 pieces that I had published. I just got good fortune. Everything I wrote, they wanted. But I didn't show him my book. I showed it to him. Mm-hmm. And he was the reason it got published. He suggested it get edited, and I think it was John Davies here, an editor, gave it to him, and he did a terrific job. He edited my book.
Best editor I've ever had.
I was delighted.
Yes.
What's that?
Yes. University of Georgia Press.
Yes. Yep.
Right. He was just terrific. He was at the press when I contacted him, and he sent me back. I took almost every expression. He didn't understand military terms because I was in the Army, and there's an Army story. He just didn't get certain things. But other than that, he was terrific. So I don't know why I brought up.
I'm so glad we video recorded you making that gesture. It would have been a shame to
Forgot
lose
about that. Cut.
Yes.
I wish you'd have done it the other way.
I want to apologize to Nicole's parents when they watch this video online. Nicole was not here. She was not responsible for that. I will take the blame for that.
Jonathan, he had something.
I like to tell a Conroy story that I've never been able to tell anybody at any gathering like this at all.
We were given permission to run long, and I said, Terry Kay is on the panel. Obviously, we're going to run long. So let's close out with this.
Excuse me? No, as a matter of fact, I
No,
love it.
come on. Let's hear it, Terry. We want to hear it.
No, we want to
No,
hear it.
come on.
Yeah.
Audience,
I'll make it real fast.
make it Terry Kay
Take
based.
its time.
I was doing a something. Maybe we were at lunch. I don't remember what it was. Anyway, we decided to go back over to his apartment at Ansley Park and just sit around and chat for a while. And we were sitting there. He was in one of those lean-back chairs with an ottoman in front of it, footstool, talking about books we were writing. And I said, Pat, I've just finished a book that I really liked, and I'm sure you read it. He actually read. I don't think I ever said anything about a book that he had not read. He was a great reader, great reader. And he said, what was it? And I said, it's 100 Years of Solitude by Marquez. He leaned back in his chair and he laced his hands behind his head like this. And he quoted the first 2 or 3 paragraphs of it. Now, that in itself is not astounding. Everybody in this room can quote something from something. Everybody in here can, believe me. What astounded me was he got up and he walked into his writing room and he came back holding the book, 100 Years of Solitude. And he said, of all the people I've ever read, this is the one person I would emulate if I could. It made me really appreciate his thoughtfulness about the written word, about books. And he did not emulate Marquez. He emulated Thomas Wolfe very, very well, but he did not. It wasn't the other. But he knew it, and he knew the meaning behind a lot of the stuff. And we had a long talk about it. Probably the most impressive moment I ever had with him was in that moment. It was very private.
To pick up both on Terry's story and something that Cliff said earlier, a good writing day for Pat was 3 to 5 handwritten pages, but a good reading day was 200 pages. That's the ratio of reader to writer in Pat's life. He was always first and foremost a reader. And if you would come to his house and start talking to him, a conversation about anything, he would disappear for a moment and come back with a book. At the end, his personal library, and this is important to say since we're in a library right now, his personal library had 8,000 books in it between 2 houses. And it was organized in a way that made sense only to one person, Pat Conroy, but he could find any book at any time. It was amazing to see. So in some ways, he sort of recreated his experience of walking into your store, Cliff, of surrounding himself with 10,000 books. I mean, that sort of spoke to him in that moment, and he lived that way throughout his life. So I hope we've given you some glimpses into what Pat was like. One of his Beaufort High School students, Pat taught at 2 years at Beaufort High before going to DeFusky, and one of his students wrote me this beautiful email and said, when the book came out, I knew I wanted to own it, but I wasn't sure I wanted to read it. I didn't necessarily want to be sad 67 times. I didn't want to read 67 eulogies. And it's not that at all. If you've paid attention and heard the stories that we've been able to share up here, there's a lot of humor to it, a lot of depth. And it's an honest portrait of Pat, too, and it's one I hope you all will enjoy. So if you have questions for our panelists, it will cost you the low, low price of a book to ask that question in the signing line. And I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank all of you for being here with us today. So thank you.